What if the city that once symbolized opportunity, freedom, and unlimited possibility has quietly become a financial trap, even for those who only want to visit? New York was sold to the world as a destination where dreams begin, careers explode, and experiences justify any sacrifice. But today, something has shifted in a way that feels uncomfortable to say out loud. Fewer people are planning trips, more people are canceling at the last minute, and those who arrive often leave with the same sentence on their lips: "I didn't expect it to be this expensive, or this exhausting." For decades, visiting New York meant accepting high prices in exchange for energy, culture, and the feeling of being at the center of the world. That trade made sense. What no one prepared visitors for is what happens when the cost keeps rising, but the reward quietly shrinks. The city still looks glamorous in photos, films, and social media, but the lived experience has started to fracture. Behind the skyline and the bright lights, there is a growing sense that the math no longer works. Here is the uncomfortable question most travel content avoids. When did a simple trip turn into a financial risk assessment? Planning a visit to New York now feels less like choosing a destination and more like navigating a minefield of hidden costs, inflated prices, and psychological pressure. Flights are only the first illusion. The real expenses begin the moment you imagine landing. Accommodation, food, transportation, basic movement through the city all come with price tags that stack faster than most visitors expect. And the worst part is that none of this arrives as a single shocking bill. It arrives slowly in fragments, designed to feel manageable until it suddenly is not. This is why so many people say they want to visit New York but never actually go. The barrier is no longer desire, it is fear. Fear of losing control of the budget. Fear of being trapped in a city where every step seems to charge a fee. Fear of realizing, halfway through the trip, that the experience does not justify the financial strain. These are not dramatic exaggerations. They are quiet realizations happening in hotel rooms, subway platforms, and restaurant tables across the city. And yet, almost no one talks about this openly. Travel marketing continues to sell the fantasy. Influencers show highlights, not receipts. The city's image remains frozen in a version of itself that no longer matches daily reality. This gap between promise and experience is where frustration grows. New York did not suddenly collapse. It slowly normalized financial pressure until visitors stopped questioning whether it should be this hard just to exist there for a few days. What makes this moment different is that the traps are no longer subtle. They are structural. They are embedded in how the city operates, charges, and extracts value from anyone who passes through. And once you start seeing them, it becomes impossible to unsee them. Before we go any further, it's important to pause for a second. What you are hearing right now is not a travel rant, and it's not an attack on a city. It's an attempt to understand a system that quietly reshaped the experience of visiting New York without most people realizing it. And this only works if you are actively processing what is being said, not just listening in the background. If you have ever considered visiting New York, already visited, or even dreamed about it at some point in your life, this conversation affects you directly. That is why engagement here matters. When you leave a comment, you are not just boosting a video. You are adding a real human data point to a discussion that is usually dominated by marketing slogans and curated images. Share whether you have visited New York, canceled a trip, or felt shocked by the costs. Even a simple sentence helps expose what is usually hidden. Liking this video tells the algorithm that this kind of honest, critical analysis deserves space instead of endless romanticized narratives. Subscribing means you want more content that questions the stories we are sold about cities, success, and the so-called urban dream. This channel exists to slow things down, look beneath the surface, and say what is usually left unsaid. The first real financial trap most visitors fall into is not a fancy attraction or an overpriced souvenir. It is something far more basic and unavoidable: having a place to sleep. New York's accommodation market has transformed into a pressure system that quietly punishes anyone who is not extremely wealthy or extremely prepared. On the surface, prices look high but manageable, But once you dig one layer deeper, the illusion breaks. Hotel rooms shrink while prices expand. What would be considered a cramped space in almost any other city is normalized here as efficient, cozy, or urban. Visitors pay premium rates for rooms where opening a suitcase requires rearranging furniture. This alone creates a subtle psychological stress. Rest becomes compromised. Recovery disappears. The city demands energy, but the place meant to restore you actively drains it. Then come the hidden layers. Taxes stack on top of already inflated nightly rates. Resort fees appear even when there is no resort. Cleaning fees, service fees, and city fees quietly inflate the final bill. What looked like a tolerable price when booking becomes something very different when the credit card notification arrives, and this happens before the trip even begins. Short-term rentals were once presented as an escape from this system. Today, they are often worse. Legal gray zones, sudden cancellations, extra rules, surprise deposits, and hostile enforcement have turned many stays into anxiety machines. Visitors arrive unsure whether their accommodation is fully compliant, worried about last-minute issues, or forced into inconvenient locations far from anything they planned to see. Distance then creates new costs in time, transportation, and exhaustion. Here is where the trap tightens. Because accommodation is so expensive, visitors feel pressure to get their money's worth. They push themselves harder. They skip rest. They accept discomfort as part of the deal. This transforms the trip into a performance. You are no longer exploring a city. You are trying to justify a bill. Every quiet moment in the room feels wasted. Every pause feels expensive. And this pressure compounds. A bad night of sleep leads to irritability. Irritability leads to rushed decisions. Rushed decisions lead to spending mistakes. Suddenly, the accommodation cost is no longer an isolated problem. It becomes the foundation for a chain reaction that affects the entire trip. What makes this especially dangerous is how normalized it has become. People expect New York to be expensive, so they stop questioning whether it should be this extreme. They accept discomfort as prestige. They treat exhaustion as proof they are doing it right. But beneath that mindset is a simple reality. A city that makes rest unaffordable creates visitors who are already depleted before the experience even begins. This is not accidental. It is structural. And once accommodation stops being a neutral base and starts acting as a financial and psychological stressor, every other cost becomes heavier, sharper, and harder to absorb. Once you step outside your accommodation, the next financial trap closes, almost immediately, and it does not announce itself with a warning sign. Food in New York is no longer just expensive, it is structurally punishing. Eating stops being a pleasure or a cultural experience and turns into a constant calculation that follows you from morning to night. What surprises most visitors is not a single outrageous bill, but the rhythm of relentless spending that never pauses. Breakfast used to be the cheapest meal, a small reset before the city swallowed your energy. Today, even that illusion is gone. A simple coffee and something basic to eat quietly costs what a full meal would in many other cities. Portions shrink, prices rise, and the expectation is that you accept it without question. The city trains visitors to lower their standards while raising their spending. That psychological shift happens faster than most people realize. Lunch arrives with a different kind of pressure. You are already tired from walking, navigating crowds, and processing noise. Cooking is not an option. Cheap alternatives barely exist in the areas visitors naturally end up in. So you compromise. You choose places that look casual, but charge premium prices for average food. You tell yourself it is just part of the experience. But what is really happening is that convenience is being monetized at every step. Dinner is where the trap becomes undeniable. Restaurants sell atmosphere and identity more than food. Menus are designed to look approachable while quietly hiding inflated prices. Taxes and tips turn already high numbers into something heavier. The moment you sit down, the meter starts running. You feel pressure to enjoy it, to make it worth it, even when the experience does not match the cost. Disappointment becomes expensive, and that makes it harder to admit. Then there are the invisible layers. Snacks between meals. water bought because you are exhausted, a quick bite grabbed because going back to your accommodation feels too far. These micro expenses stack faster than large ones because they feel harmless in isolation. By the end of the day, many visitors realize they spent far more eating than they planned, without ever feeling satisfied. This constant spending creates a deeper effect. Hunger and stress mix. Decision-making worsens. People skip meals to save money, then overpay later out of fatigue. Others force themselves into cheaper options that drain energy and mood. Either way, food stops nourishing and starts controlling the experience. The city dictates when you eat, how you eat, and how much it costs you to stay functional. What makes this trap especially effective is how normalized it is. New York is famous for food, so visitors expect high prices and silence their discomfort. They confuse reputation with value. But when basic nourishment becomes a source of anxiety, something fundamental has broken. A city that makes eating stressful turns every day into a negotiation with your own limits. Transportation in New York presents itself as efficient, iconic, and unavoidable. That is exactly why it becomes one of the most effective financial traps for visitors. At first glance, it seems simple. A subway card, a few rides, maybe the occasional app-based car when you are tired. But once you start moving through the city, transportation stops being a tool and starts acting like a silent drain that never fully stops charging. The subway is marketed as the great equalizer. Fast, cheap, democratic. In reality, it is only cheap in isolation. Each swipe feels small enough not to matter, which is precisely the problem. Visitors underestimate how often they will need to move. Distances look short on a map but feel endless on foot. Fatigue accumulates faster than expected. Suddenly, what was supposed to be just a few rides turns into constant movement from morning to night. Those small charges stack quietly, day after day, without triggering any alarm. Then there is time. Waiting on platforms, navigating, delays, missing connections, standing in packed cars. Time becomes part of the cost. Visitors lose hours simply trying to get from one place to another. That lost time translates into rushed decisions, missed plans, and a growing temptation to pay more just to escape the system. This is where ride-hailing apps enter the picture, not as luxury, but as relief. App-based transportation feels like a solution until it reveals its true price. Surge pricing appears exactly when you need it most. Rain, exhaustion, late nights, safety concerns all trigger higher fares. What starts as a convenient shortcut quickly becomes one of the most expensive parts of the trip. And because you are already tired, you accept it. You stop comparing. You stop questioning. You just want the day to end. There is also the psychological toll of constant navigation. New York demands attention at all times. Signs, announcements, crowds, interruptions. Visitors are forced into a permanent state of alert. That mental fatigue pushes people toward choices that feel easier, but cost more. A taxi instead of another confusing transfer. A longer route because it feels safer. Transportation becomes not just a financial cost, but a cognitive one. Another layer rarely discussed is how transportation shapes where visitors feel allowed to exist. People cluster around areas that feel accessible, familiar, and worth the ride. Entire neighborhoods become invisible because reaching them feels risky or exhausting. This limits experience while increasing spending in already overpriced zones. The city funnels visitors into the most expensive paths, not by force, but by friction. By the end of the trip, many people realize transportation costs them far more than expected, not just in money but in energy and attention. They plan their days around movement instead of experience. They remember lines, delays, and navigation stress more vividly than places themselves. When getting around a city feels like work, the city stops feeling welcoming. By the time most visitors think they understand their spending in New York, the city introduces a quieter and far more corrosive trap. Fragmented costs that feel small, justified, and unavoidable in isolation, but become overwhelming in total. This is where financial control truly slips away. Not through one outrageous expense, but through dozens of charges that barely register emotionally while steadily dismantling the budget. Taxes appear everywhere, and rarely where you expect them. The price you see is almost never the price you pay. Sales tax, city tax, special district tax, service charges, processing fees. Each one feels minor, even reasonable. But together, they form a constant reminder that nothing in the city is straightforward. Every transaction becomes a guessing game. Visitors stop calculating because calculation becomes exhausting. Then there are tips. In New York, tipping is not gratitude, it is obligation. It follows you into cafes, bars, restaurants, delivery apps, taxis, hotels, and even self-service screens. Suggested tip percentages climb higher, and social pressure does the rest. Saying no feels wrong. Lowering the amount feels awkward. Visitors tip not because service was exceptional, but because the system quietly demands it. What was once discretionary becomes mandatory through expectation. This creates a psychological distortion. People begin mentally separating real costs from extra costs, even though both come from the same wallet. The bill feels acceptable until the tip appears. The meal feels affordable until the tax is added. Over time, this fragmentation prevents visitors from ever feeling the full weight of what they are spending in the moment. Awareness comes later, often after the trip is over. There is also the constant presence of convenience fees. Want to book something quickly? There is a fee. Want flexibility? Another fee. Want to avoid lines, delays, or uncertainty? Premium. Pricing appears instantly. The city monetizes relief. The more overwhelmed you feel, the more expensive your choices become. Stress is not just a byproduct of the system. It is part of the revenue model. What makes this especially damaging is how normalized it feels. Visitors are subtly trained not to question it. Complaining feels naive. Resistance feels pointless. So people adapt by spending more while pretending they are spending less. This illusion holds until credit card statements arrive, or until the final days of the trip feel financially suffocating. These fragmented costs also create emotional fatigue. Every purchase requires micro-decisions. Do I tip here? How much is expected? Am I being cheap or realistic? This constant negotiation drains attention and enjoyment. The city demands mental energy even for the smallest interactions. Over time, this turns a visit into a series of financial calculations instead of lived moments. At this stage, the trip stops feeling like a visit and starts resembling something closer to extraction. Tourism in New York has quietly shifted from offering experiences to harvesting attention, patience, and money with maximum efficiency. What looks like choice is often just a funnel. Visitors are guided, nudged, and pressured into spending paths that feel optional but are structurally unavoidable. Attractions are the most obvious example. Ticket prices climb while the experience itself becomes thinner. Lines grow longer. Time slots shrink. Skip-the-line upgrades appear everywhere, quietly reframing frustration as a monetization opportunity. You can wait for hours, or you can pay more. Either way, the system wins. The attraction is no longer the value. Your tolerance for inconvenience is. Even so-called free experiences are rarely free. Observation decks require tickets. Museums suggest donations that feel mandatory. Public spaces are surrounded by vendors, performers, and pop-up charges. You are constantly invited to pay just to feel like you are fully participating. Standing still becomes uncomfortable. Consuming becomes the default. What makes this especially effective is how identity is sold alongside the experience. You are not just buying a ticket. You are buying the right to say you were there. Photos become proof of value. Social pressure fills the gaps where satisfaction should be. If the experience feels empty, the image must still justify the cost. Disappointment gets masked by documentation. The city also fragments experiences to multiply spending. One location is never enough. One activity always leads to another suggested upgrade nearby. Routes are designed to pass shops, counters, pop-ups, and branded moments. You are rarely allowed to simply arrive, experience, and leave. There is always another opportunity to spend before you can disengage. Tourism zones amplify this effect. Prices inflate far beyond what residents would tolerate. Quality often drops because demand is constant and rotating. Visitors sense this but accept it because they feel temporary. That mindset is part of the trap. Temporary discomfort feels acceptable until it defines the entire trip. There is a deeper psychological cost here. When everything is designed to extract, visitors become guarded. They stop trusting the environment. Every interaction feels transactional. Curiosity turns into caution. Wonder turns into calculation. The city loses its ability to surprise in positive ways because every surprise carries a price tag. By the end, many people realize they spent heavily without feeling deeply moved, enriched, or changed. They did everything they were supposed to do. They went where the guides pointed. They paid what was asked. And still, something feels missing. That emptiness is not accidental. It is the byproduct of a system optimized for throughput, not meaning. Beyond money, there is another cost that visitors rarely calculate before arriving, but almost everyone feels once they are inside the city: constant tension. Security concerns, social friction, and background stress quietly enter the experience and start charging interest on your attention and emotional energy. This is not about dramatic fear or isolated incidents. It is about the low-level alertness that never turns off. Visitors quickly learn to scan their surroundings. Subways feel unpredictable. Crowds feel compressed. Sirens, shouting, sudden movements, and visible distress become part of the soundscape. Even when nothing directly happens to you, your nervous system stays engaged. This creates fatigue that money alone cannot fix. By mid-trip, many people feel mentally worn down in ways they did not expect from a vacation. This tension shapes behavior. People choose routes that feel safer, even if they are longer or more expensive. They leave earlier than planned. They avoid certain areas entirely. They rely more heavily on paid transportation at night. Each of these choices adds cost, but more importantly, they narrow experience. The city becomes something to manage rather than explore. There is also the emotional discomfort of witnessing visible inequality and crisis at close range. Homelessness, mental health struggles, and social breakdown are not hidden in New York. They are part of the daily landscape. For some visitors, this creates guilt. For others, anxiety. For many, a sense of unease they cannot easily explain. The city demands emotional processing even when you are just trying to get through the day. Over time, this constant exposure erodes enjoyment. Moments that should feel spontaneous feel guarded. Laughter feels interrupted. Relaxation feels temporary. Visitors realize they are spending energy simply maintaining composure. That energy drain has consequences. People overspend to escape it. A ride instead of a walk. A hotel room instead of another evening out. Comfort becomes a product, and it is priced accordingly. This is where the psychological cost turns financial again. The more stressed you feel, the more likely you are to pay for relief. The city quietly benefits from your discomfort. Stress is not just present, it is monetized. And because this stress is normalized, few people question whether it should be part of the deal at all. What makes this especially difficult to talk about is the fear of sounding weak or ungrateful. New York is framed as tough, intense, and demanding. If you feel overwhelmed, the implication is that you simply could not handle it. That narrative keeps people silent. But silence does not erase the cost. It just hides it. By the time visitors reach this point, many sense that something is fundamentally off, yet almost no one around them seems willing to say it out loud. This is where the final trap tightens: collective denial. New York survives not only through high prices and constant extraction, but through a shared agreement to pretend that what is happening is normal, acceptable, and even desirable. The city does not need to silence critics aggressively. It simply overwhelms them until they doubt their own perception. Marketing plays a central role in this. The images never change. The skyline still shines. The slogans still promise excitement, opportunity, and magic. Media coverage focuses on resilience, reinvention, and cultural relevance, rarely on daily erosion. Travel content highlights highlights. Influencers frame exhaustion as intensity, stress as energy, and financial strain as worth it. The narrative is carefully curated to make discomfort feel like part of the privilege. Visitors absorb this messaging before they arrive, and it shapes how they interpret their own experience. When costs spiral, they assume it is their fault for not planning well enough. When stress builds, they tell themselves that this is just how New York is. When disappointment creeps in, they silence it with photos, posts, and forced enthusiasm. Admitting that the trip feels wrong threatens the identity they were sold. This denial extends beyond tourists. Residents normalize survival as lifestyle. Struggle becomes character. Burnout becomes ambition. Complaints are reframed as weakness or entitlement. The city rewards those who endure quietly and marginalizes those who question the structure. In that environment, acknowledging decline feels almost taboo, as if naming it might collapse the illusion holding everything together. What makes this dangerous is that denial delays adaptation. Systems continue to degrade because discomfort is absorbed instead of challenged. Visitors keep paying because the fantasy remains intact just long enough. The gap between image and reality widens, but few institutions have an incentive to close it. The city continues operating on momentum and myth rather than livability. For visitors, this creates a subtle form of self-betrayal. You feel the tension, the costs, the fatigue, but you suppress the conclusion. You tell yourself it was still a good trip. You justify the expense. You move on. Only later, when someone asks if you would go back, does the hesitation surface. The answer stalls. The myth weakens. This is how decline becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is collectively rebranded as normal. And when enough people accept that framing, the city does not need to change. It simply waits for the next wave of visitors willing to believe. When you step back and connect all these layers, the question stops being about New York as a destination and starts becoming something much larger. What you are witnessing is not a temporary downturn or a bad phase. It is a structural warning. New York functions as an advanced version of a model that many global cities are moving toward, where the idea of access remains alive while the reality of affordability quietly disappears. The city still stands. The buildings are still there. The lights still turn on every night. But the promise that once justified, the cost has eroded. Visiting New York now feels less like entering a cultural capital and more like stress testing your finances, patience, and emotional resilience. The city no longer asks whether you can afford to come. It assumes you will figure it out or quietly opt out. This is why fewer people openly say they want to visit. Desire has not vanished. Trust has. People sense that the return no longer matches the investment. They hear stories from friends who came back exhausted instead of inspired. They read between the lines of social media posts that look impressive but feel strangely hollow. The city's reputation survives, but enthusiasm weakens. What makes this moment critical is that New York is not alone. It is simply ahead. Other major urban centers are watching, learning, and replicating similar systems of extraction. High cost of entry, fragmented fees, monetized stress, normalized discomfort. The myth of the global city remains powerful, but the lived reality grows increasingly hostile to anyone without extreme wealth or institutional protection. In this sense, New York stops being a dream destination and becomes a case study. It shows what happens when a city prioritizes image, revenue, and throughput over human experience, when tourism becomes extraction, when residents normalize survival, when visitors quietly retreat instead of demanding better. Collapse does not arrive with sirens. It arrives with resignation. The most unsettling part is how quiet this shift has been. No official announcement, no dramatic failure, just a slow redefinition of what is acceptable. What once felt absurd now feels normal. What once felt exciting now feels heavy. And once that emotional shift takes hold, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. The real question, then, is not whether New York will recover its appeal. It is whether people will continue accepting this version of urban life as the price of relevance. Because when a city becomes impossible to enjoy even temporarily, it sends a message far beyond its borders. If you have felt that hesitation, that pause when thinking about returning, or that realization that the dream no longer matches reality, leave a comment with a word like warning or a short phrase that captures how this video made you feel. If you stayed until this point, you are already part of a smaller group of people who are willing to look past the glossy images and confront uncomfortable realities. That matters more than you might think. This channel exists for those who want to understand what is really happening beneath the surface of modern cities, not just consume the stories we are told. If this analysis resonated with you, subscribe to the channel now so you do not miss the next breakdown appearing on your screen. These videos are designed to connect the dots others avoid and to question urban myths before they quietly become accepted truths. Leave a like if this video helped you see New York from a different angle. And if you made it all the way here, leave a comment with the word aware or write one short sentence about whether you would still plan a trip to New York after this. Your comment helps shape the next videos and keeps this conversation alive. Now, click on the next video appearing on your screen. It continues this discussion by exposing another city or system where the illusion is starting to crack.